My name is Imran Khalid, and I work with the Sustainable Development Policy Institute. And you're joining a seminar that's part of a series that we're holding in light of the COVID-19 disease and its policy repercussions and how it's impacting the economy. Um, we're working from home these days, but what we've done is we've gotten a hold of some experts and people who've been out in the field and who know what's going on, and we're trying to reach out to them and make them a part of the series. And today, it's our great pleasure to have with us Ms. Catherine Bertini, who's been the head of the World Food Program. She's been Under Secretary General for Management at the United Nations. She's worked at Syracuse University as a professor. She's currently with the Chicago Council. So it's wonderful to have her with us. But before we begin, I'd just quickly like to go around and have a few people introduce us, introduce themselves. I see Fatima is here. Fatima, may I please request you to just briefly introduce yourself, and then.
I think we lost Fatima. She couldn't hear us. I think she'll sign in again, but I'll go ahead and just give a brief introduction. My name is Aisha Kesrani, and I work as a senior research associate at SDPI. And the areas that I work on mostly are migration and climate adaptation.
Okay. I see Adnan. Adnan, can you please say something briefly?
Yes, I'm Adnan Hassan from SDPI. I'm working as SDPI and IT coordinator, and I'm there to support you.
Assalamu alaikum. I'm Fatima, and I'm working as visiting research fellow of SDPI.
Your area of expertise?
I did my PhD on intercultural dialogue between Muslim countries and Western countries. Now I'm working on cultural entrepreneurs and dialogue.
Okay. We'll just start now, and hopefully more people will join us as we move forward. So, Professor Bertini, I just gave a very brief introduction about you. So, if I were to ask you, who is Catherine Bertini? If you can just give some insights into who you are as a person and a professional, that would really help us get started.
Well, thanks, Imran, and thank you so much for inviting me to join you and all the colleagues today. And this kind of conversation is really important, I think, as we think about where we're going in the future and how we can best direct our own thinking, our own resources. So thank you for inviting me. My name is Catherine Bertini. I'm a very fortunate woman. I was born into a very caring family, but modest, to say the least, from an economic well-being perspective. And my parents both worked because they had to, and they had 4 children. I was the oldest. I learned from an early age from them that there was an importance of giving back, that there was an importance of community and developing community. And that's much of where I took my career. My father used to have me learn from philosophers and learn about basic principles of government, of life. And I've tried to live some of those myself. I went into government after 10 years in the private sector and 5 years before that in politics. But I wanted to go into government since I was in high school. And I found that I had skill sets for organizational management and for leading large organizations, and that what I really cared about was helping provide services to people who might need services and not know how to access them or how to receive them or how to find help to be able to survive. So I was able to marry those two and use my skills as a leader and manager connected to my passion for helping others to lead big organizations for change directed around helping the people that we were supposed to be working with. Therefore, when I was at the U.S. government, I was in charge of the organization that was handling cash assistance to poor women and their children. And I was able to focus that much more on training and education for those mothers. With the U.S. Department of Agriculture, we used to give out food stamps, and we changed it to use electronic benefit transfer for food stamps. We also added food for breastfeeding mothers in the Women, Infants, and Children program. When I was at WFP, we can talk more about that later, but I was able to do a lot of things to lead change in the organization to make it more efficient and effective and more directed toward people, I hope. At least that was our intent. And then at the UN to try to make some of the bureaucracy a little more people-centered, although that was probably the biggest challenge of all. So since I retired from the UN, I've been teaching, as Imran said, at the Maxwell School in Syracuse. That's where I had the honor and pleasure of meeting him. I've been working with the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation as they first set up their agriculture development portfolio and helping them be more sensitive to the needs of women farmers. I've been working with the Chicago Council on Global Affairs, especially on issues relating to agriculture development and to girls in rural economies. And I worked recently with the Rockefeller Foundation, which is where I wrote a report about leadership. So that's me.
Thank you. So you started, you joined WFP in 1992, and can you just, for the benefit of the audience, explain how that worked? I mean, it was an appointment by the president of the United States at that time. Is that right?
Well, the Americans like to say that, but it's not. So you might have read that in some American publication. I was recommended by George H.W. Bush, but I was appointed jointly by the Secretary General and the Director General of FAO. But you know, any of these UN jobs, whether it was Nafis Sadiq, who was the first woman ever to run a UN agency, and when she ran UNFPA, or a current UN agency head, you have to have the endorsement of your government before the UN will consider appointing you. So so that's what happened. I was recommended by President Bush for an open position. Then when I was up for re-election or reappointment 5 years later, President Clinton was the president, and I was a Republican, a Bush recommendee. So I had to meet with all different political officials in the Clinton administration who decided that I was doing a good job and that they would endorse my reappointment. Then Kofi Annan and the Director General of FAO reappointed me.
Okay. So when you joined the WFP in '92, I think in a paper that I've shared with my colleagues, you mentioned that the organization had 17% women working for it because it was deemed, that guys who were handling trucks, trains, planes, and ships, I mean, it was a guy thing to do. And so perhaps it wasn't an organization where women would be comfortable or even welcome. But 10 years later, the number was 39%. By the time you left, there were the number of women in the organization was 39%. I mean, was the WFP not doing guy things anymore, or?
No, WFP does lots of guy things, according to that old definition in 1992, as you pointed out. But we found a lot of women who actually worked in those areas. You know how often people say, "Oh, we can't find any women to do that. Oh, women aren't trained to do this." Don't ever listen to that. It's just not true in virtually every field. Oh no, women aren't port captains. Oh no, women don't know anything about helicopters. And I mean, we found women to do all of these jobs. Nordic women, African women, North American women, women from all around the world were doing these jobs. And so I mentioned in the leadership paper that one of those women that we hired early on was a woman named Fatma Samora in logistics. And she's the Director General of FIFA these days. So guess what? That's one of the biggest logistics jobs of all. But WFP certainly is on the front lines of logistics all around the world, especially in emergencies. And even now in creating different systems to try to react to the coronavirus.
Okay.
But Imran, if I might, one thing about hiring women though, it's not enough for the head of the organization to say it's important to hire women. It doesn't do it. People don't necessarily listen to that. You have to have one of two things, if not both. You have to have either a business reason to hire women, In other words, we said, look, we want to make WFP more effective. We have to understand what the people preparing the food actually need. So we have to listen to the cooks. And the cooks are mostly women. So it was very hard to argue intellectually that we should be giving out food to men and listening to men about what the food needs are of the family. If in fact, in most of the places of the world, women are the ones that are actually cooking it, because our mission was to end hunger, and those were the people in the family most invested in the same mission. So that was one. But the other thing was, ultimately, I put it in people's performance plans for the year that they had to hire women. So if a person was a hiring manager, they would be doing an adequate job in that one particular point in their performance measure if they had hired 50% women. I also put in a point for hiring developing country nationals also, because I didn't want us to continue to be so much of a place from the North, by the North, for the North. I wanted to have a lot more people from the South on the staff. So we did well in both of those, or at least well enough so that there's now a critical mass. Thanks.
Thank you. And I guess we'll come back to gender again, because this is something that SDPI focuses on a lot. This is something that the development sector in Pakistan focuses on a lot. I mean, I work on water, and water is something that has a different impact on women versus men, and you need to have an understanding of the gender relationship in this regard. And so,
Exactly.
So this current event is about leadership. What does leadership mean to you, if I may?
When I was researching this paper, I found a paper that was written by a man named Fabrizio Hochschild, who used to work at the High Commission for Refugees, and now he works for the Secretary General of the UN in New York. And he wrote about courage as it relates to leadership. And I thought about courage for soldiers, or courage for poor mothers trying to take care of their sick children and find enough food for them. I never thought about courage with leadership. And to me, it was one of the most important findings, and I wrote about it in the paper, that being a good leader requires you to be courageous, requires you to take tough decisions that might not be the most popular decisions. It requires you to research very well what you're going to do, but then do it and stick to it. Requires you to listen, but yet not put off decisions. We all know leaders, whether in our own work or somewhere else, who are really smart, really bright, who we really like to work with and exchange ideas, but they're timid about making decisions. Whether it's personnel decisions, or whether it's telling you how you could improve your job, or whether it's a big change. And in this case, leaders who can actually manage these crises. And we see now leaders that are all around the world that are torn between, well, if I do this, it's going to be very tough, and a lot of people are going to be mad at me, but my public health professionals are telling me it's the best thing to do. But if I do this, that's what my constituencies probably want more, and that'll be the easier, I'll get less political slack from it. Or, you have to make the really tough, difficult decisions if you're a leader, and they're not easy.
Right. And so you mentioned the current scenario. So in the same vein, how do you see crises that come up? There's a lot of talk about finding opportunities in crisis, but is it even possible when you suddenly turn to firefighting, as we are doing nowadays with the COVID-19? Do we still look for opportunities? Do we still try and find that courage, even though it might backfire on us? So I'm thinking it's a balancing act, but at the same time, if you try to balance yourself, then perhaps you might miss that opportunity to be a leader. So what do you say?
Well, first and foremost is the crisis. So leaders have to do what they can do to, you say, put out the fire, manage the crises. And we all have to do that in our own spaces too, whether it's our household or our work, our employment, or our community, or not just the elected leadership or appointed leadership. But I mean, governmental leadership. But I do think we should look at silver linings of this, and that's part of our jobs as citizens of the world, but also as responsible members of our own communities and our own offices. So I think the first and foremost thing we can do is manage ourselves, right? I mean, first of all, we've got to manage how we're dealing with this ourselves, how we're dealing with what's happening around us as we're keeping safe ourselves. In some cases, it's issues of contemplating our own mortality. In other cases, it's issues of getting enough exercise, of being sure of eating right. But first and foremost, we have to manage ourselves. Then when we have the intellectual space to think about what's next or what could be incorporated, I think we should think about how this, one of the things we should think about, and excuse me for sipping tea once in a while, I have a little scratchy throat, but I think we need to think about more broadly about how is this changing the world, and what issues do we care about that we might be able to use to help frame the post-corona reconstruction. And to give some examples, there's so much of what we're doing right now. There's so much Zooming and GoToMeeting planning and Skyping. Now that we see how relatively easy that is, even though we don't have the human touch, this is going to change a lot of things. It's, I think, going to change medicine to make perhaps a lot more telemedicine, as one of my friends is pointing out to me. It's, I think, going to change institutions, especially institutions of learning, higher education, which has been put such a priority on bricks and mortar and on tenure, for instance. Is this going to change so that we have more online learning? And as we're finding more experts on the internet that aren't necessarily part of universities, is that going to change our thoughts about where's the best education going to come from? How are those kind of things going to change? What about childcare? We all have children now, or many of us have children now at home. We could see more clearly what they really need, and how might that work in the future? Will we go back to institutional childcare, and if so, under what parameters, and how can we think about that? Farmers, at least around in my local area, are doing much more direct selling to individuals rather than going through multiple stages of middlemen. Is that a new model for the future? And businesses that have been able to pivot, whether they're making equipment that's needed for the emergency or whether they're just redoing what they do in order to manufacture or cook. So many different things to think about. And what about, a couple of people said they were working on climate. What about the environment? Well, such nice stories about Venice or Beijing or maybe Islamabad. I haven't read where the smog used to be so bad, and now you can actually go outside without a mask if you weren't masking for the virus. And swans are coming back up the rivers, and fish. What kind of lesson is that teaching us for the future, and how can we maximize that people's paying attention to that kind of thing? So I think there's a lot of things to think about creatively about the future. I think to the folks that are in economics and trade, as someone said, I think trade is more problematic because it's kind of a knee-jerk reaction to hold back everything. Remember in the 2008 world food price crisis, when a lot of countries said, well, we're not exporting anymore. And when Russia canceled its exports, its flour exports, or wheat exports, I guess, to Egypt, that was kind of one of the last straws before people started demonstrating in Cairo for more access to food and less expensive food. So now when countries saying, I'm not going to export my masks, or I'm not going to export anything, It's a knee-jerk natural reaction, but our getting over it is going to be problematic. And then one more point is thinking about how we get people to be comfortable again, not yet, but at some point, with going back into public. How do we get people more comfortable traveling? How do we get countries comfortable accepting travelers? We have to wait till there's a vaccine in order to say, hi, I'm vaccinated, I can come into your country? Or is there some other way that using antibodies or something else that we can show that we are, if we have to show that we're safe to be near? I don't have answers to this, but again, one of my future friends has said, how are we going to be comfortable again in the public? What needs to be done? I don't know the answer. So anyway, those are just some of the things that I've been thinking about or talking about when we think about the future. But it is opportunity. It is, let's not sit home and say, oh no, how this is terrible. Well, how can we make this, what's happening now, into something much better in the future?
So looking back at your career, perhaps looking back at your tenure at WFP, perhaps even earlier at the USDA, does anything similar come to mind? I know this is something of a global scale, but I'm thinking about anecdotes where you can point to decision making that could have happened when struggling with the crisis and how it was resolved.
Yeah, decision making, again, it needs tough leadership. Of course, there's been nothing like this, but when we look at Ebola, I was gone from WFP, but one of the issues was, again, this cross-border issue, because some of the humanitarian organizations went back to countries where their workers were from. It said, if somebody from your country gets sick in West Africa, will you take them home? Will you take them back? Some countries said no. They got to be, stay there and get better. We're not going to take them back. Wow, that's a real risk factor. So that is quite problematic. I can think of several different things. One of them was actually in Pakistan, Afghanistan in 2001, 2002, when, as you remember, after 9/11, the UN international staff were brought out of Afghanistan. Many stayed in Pakistan, and but we had to run operations, and we led them out of Pakistan. So the UN put so many rules, security rules especially, about what we couldn't do, and then we couldn't go into Afghanistan. It was really quite difficult. I wouldn't say that we flaunted the rules of WFP, but we carefully thought about them. But then we had very brave people working in Islamabad for Pakistan who said, well, we have to go to Afghanistan. We have to fix this. We have to go meet with the truckers and fix this route. We have to go meet with some of the people on the Afghanistan side who are going to be receiving this food, make sure they're ready to distribute it. I mean, we broke the rules. So the UN slapped us on the hand, but we kept a continuous amount of food going into the country. And I remember it was early February of 2002 when I was in Islamabad. I met with President Musharraf, and he said, I always remember this. He said to me, WFP was different than any of the other UN agencies because you were creative. You thought outside the box. You kept everything moving. You didn't hunker down to your bureaucracy. And we're very grateful, and we're grateful in part because you were able to feed people in Afghanistan, not once they came to the border. So that was small. I mean, relative, it was important to a lot of people, but small compared to the current crises. But then we faced tragedies all along the way with air crashes or with inability to get into to people. Right now, all the the humanitarian organizations are having a terrible time helping the people that are even worse off in Yemen. But it doesn't seem to be enough political leadership with enough, even before the corona crisis, with enough who put this high enough on their priority list to actually take tough decisions and get something done about bringing peace.
Right. So that provides us with a nice segue into leading change. You talk about that in your paper as well, and there's a need when you're trying to lead change. How important is it to develop a consensus? I mean, amongst the team or the decision makers, or as an executive, when you're trying to do that, when do you think, oh, I'm going to push it through because I think I've got the experience and I believe that that's the way to get things done? Because if I decide to try and develop consensus, then perhaps it might take much longer and we might not be in the same position anymore.
Well, leading means that somebody's following you. So if you're just going to make a decision that's kind of an edict, hey, we're going to go do this, and nobody follows you, what good is it? I mean, you can't just go to the Middle East and say, hey, you know, we and one party agree on something, and therefore that's what's going to happen. If other interested parties don't agree at all, then who's following you? We need to lead an organization that respects us and that puts a high priority on our decision making and where we have credibility. So it's really important to listen, and it's very important to analyze all potential issues, and it's important in planning a change process to consider all different opinions, and then to make a decision and lead. And you know, I've been in organizations where I didn't agree with everything that the leader was doing, but if I respected the leader and I thought the leader had listened to me or to people with similar views of mine, then I would follow that leader. But if I'm in an organization where the leader just says, well, now we're going to do this, my job is to follow the leader, but I won't do it very enthusiastically and maybe not so well. So it's really a careful combination, because you have to think through where you're going, you have to consult, you have to explain why you're going in a certain direction, and then you have to move. I think right now, the leaders that people are following, some people will follow any leader if they believe in him or her for other reasons, but the ones that are real, where they could get people across party lines and from different provinces and states and regions and to follow, then those are, I think, real leaders, because people can see that they're in this for the greater good, and that they're listening for the greater good, and that they're taking decisions for the greater good.
So decision making and leadership, and we talked a little bit about this a couple of days back when we were setting this up. As to, you spent a number of years in Rome, in Italy, and Italy became the center of the whole pandemic right after China. And they had their struggles, but now I think they've got a good handle on these things. So would you be able to walk us through the decision-making apparatus in Italy and how they could have, or they went about resolving this issue after their initial plans hit a roadblock? Because initially they had wanted people to just try and maintain social distancing, but it did not work out, and then they had to force that on the people.
Well, yeah, several things. First of all, we all understand the culture of Italians, right? I mean, it's a beautiful culture. It's a warm and happy and loving and culture, and lots of touching, lots of kissing, lots of hugs, even for people you don't know very well. So let's start with that. Second is that once the government realized the severity of the crisis, it did clamp down, and it had to clamp down on staying home and social distancing, and so all of that. And the anecdotal feedback that I have from my friends and relatives in Italy is that people are very much respecting that. Excuse me. To me, the error. Well, after the fact, of course, we can all point to things that everybody should have done differently. But the big thing was that the Italian medical community says now that there were 3 or 4 weeks where this disease was coming up and that it wasn't diagnosed, and that many people were having the disease in hospitals, but that it wasn't diagnosed. So that was kind of the spread time, because people would be home and spreading it, or leave the hospital spreading it, or spread it to hospital workers. We've all read stories about some of the doctors and nurses being some of the first casualties in Italy. So it seems that a key weakness was the diagnosis. And there are lots of really talented, really wonderful and dedicated medical professionals in Italy. But in my 10 years at WFP, when we needed a diagnosis of something different, something that you couldn't tell what it was, that ended up perhaps being cancer, perhaps being epilepsy, or being something that had some multiple problems, but was difficult to diagnose. Generally, they would want to go to a country, A, where all the doctors and nurses spoke their language, and B, where the medical care was considered really first class in diagnosis. So we would send English speakers to London, or French speakers to Paris, or to Switzerland, for instance. Then they'd come back to Italy and be treated extremely well by very competent physicians. But the diagnosis was key. So that's, I think, was a weakness in the system. Now, I'm not a medical person, and there could be somebody from the Italian system who will totally disagree with my saying that, but that's my observation.
United States, staying with the pandemic, the United States is a federal system just like Pakistan is. Provinces are responsible for making their own decisions here. Similarly, in the U.S., it's the states. How do you see the leadership at the state level in the U.S.? What's working for some people? What's not working for others? Perhaps shed some light into insights into that.
The biggest thing here, and perhaps in Pakistan, is that governors are making their own decisions. It's not a national decision about whether or not to ask people to stay home, whether or not to close certain businesses, whether or not to put in some protections in place. And so we still have, I think, 6 or 8 states which don't have these kind of protections in place. And they say, well, we don't have much of the virus, so we don't have to. But this is a national emergency here and in Pakistan and everywhere in the world. So I think that's one of the biggest challenges, and is to have some sort of national framework, because people travel in Pakistan around the country, or in the US around the country, and they will travel a month from now when it looks to be safer. And this could be a problem. We saw it up close in Florida. You may have seen the pictures of the college kids on spring break in the beaches in Florida having a great time, and everybody else saying, "What? Are you kidding me? We're home in our apartments or our houses, and these kids are out." And now, in a lot of cases, a lot of those young people have the virus. So. And Florida was very late in clamping down. After the kids went home and the businesses weren't going to lose that business, then they started making different decisions. But again, it wasn't even a statewide decision at first. It was county by county within the state. So well, it's another issue for scholars to discuss, right? What is the definition of federalism when it comes to a national emergency, or even what is the definition of a national emergency? And what should be different? What should be changed? Oh, we're finding, and perhaps you are too, that since it's kind of there's both a national government response and then there's state responses. So everybody's competing with themselves. They're driving up the prices of all this medical equipment that they need because they're all competing for it. So somebody would say, "Oh, good, that's the capitalism at work," and others would say, "Look, we're about saving lives. This is almost like war footing, and we've got to act as in as large regional manner as we can. In that case, it's a national matter for us and for Pakistan."
Thank you. I'm just going to open it up to some of the other colleagues to ask you questions. But before I do that, I wanted to look at conflict resolution. Is that going to change in the coming days and years, especially if this pandemic goes on for longer than a year and a half? I mean, because it might tell us that our priorities aren't in the right place. I mean, the conflicts that are happening between provinces, between different states, different regions, there are different blocks. I mean, you know, we can see that with OPEC, for example, when it comes to the oil crisis. And so, are we going to make a turn for the better? I mean, I guess it's a more philosophical question as to where we're headed. And you alluded to that earlier, but I'm thinking more broadly and seeing whether we'll think of this pandemic as an opportunity to really think the way we deal with each other as human beings.
Well, I hope so, Imran. I certainly hope so. So I would say, well, when I was teaching graduate school, I used to say, if you have an issue you really care about, when there's time and space for other people to pay attention to that issue and potentially to build capacity for that issue, you need to pounce. You need to get right into that issue and see what you can do. And again, I use the food price crisis of 2008 and beyond to make that point, because what we did in the U.S. was Dan Glickman, who was used to be a Clinton agriculture secretary. He and I led an effort with the Chicago Council to try to convince the incoming presidential administration, and at the time we didn't know if it was going to be Senator McCain or Senator Obama, but ultimately to convince President-elect Obama to prioritize agriculture development, because since the 80s, when the OECD countries used to give something like 22% of their foreign assistance for agriculture development, it was now down to 4%. And we wanted to prioritize that giving away food, as we do at WFP, which I know is a life-saving measure that's important, is a Band-Aid next to actually helping farmers be more productive themselves, so they don't need this kind of assistance. So we prioritized that, and the president agreed and made it an agenda item, which is now called Feed the Future. And then we went to Congress, and they, on a bipartisan method, made it an agenda item, put it in the law. So it is U.S. law to include efforts for helping farmers. So in the South, global South. So that's an example of pouncing, I guess. Like right now, if you wanted to talk to somebody about agriculture development, I don't think anybody would listen. They'd turn the channel. But at the time, it was the right time. So getting back to your question, any of the kind of issues that you mentioned or anything else, is it now time to pounce? Is it now time, if that's your issue, to put together how you would like that group of people to act in the future? Because right now, first of all, people are thinking of themselves in terms of their safety, but they're also thinking of the broader community. So I think a lot of things are kind of put on the back burner. Even if you're going to go out for you're going to go out for something that's not groceries, not food that you absolutely have to have, a lot of people will think, okay, do I really need that? Is it worth the potential of getting sick if I go out? So now what people are thinking about, what that means to themselves, might be a great time to start laying out plans for new models. Because once we all get better and once we know it's safe to resume business as usual, people are going to go back to their same old spaces, I think, unless they've seen some opportunities for change and for doing things better. So we don't know how long we have, but we probably don't have a lot of time to plan out brand new strategies. But I do think this is the time to try to plan them, to try to write about them. When are we going to have more time to write, really, than now? And to try to coalesce people of similar minds about whether it's changing OPEC or the Security Council. Although I always said it would take a great tragedy, a great problem in order to change the Security Council. I'd like to think that that could be a possibility here, although I'm not sure it'll ever change. But whatever, and big institutions, small institutions, how can we put out ideas for change now?
Okay, thank you for that. We'll turn to our colleagues now for some questions. There are a couple of questions from Dr. Khwaja already. I'd request other colleagues to also ask their questions. I know Fatima has one as well. So Dr. Mahmood Khwaja, who is a researcher with SDPI, and unfortunately his audio isn't working, Professor Bertini. He asks, Madam Guest Speaker emphasized courage. My question is, what makes a leader most courageous or strong?
Wow, what makes a leader most courageous or strong? It's pretty much has to be in your character. I'm not sure how you learn courage. It's got to be something that you think is. You don't have to recognize it necessarily, just use it. So how can you build on it? First of all, you could make some decisions and have them turn out okay. Then maybe that'll give you more courage to make more decisions. Maybe if you weren't so sure and you made some decisions didn't turn out okay, you'd be more hesitant. But I think it's almost a gut instinct that you feel so strongly about this, you have to stand up for it, and you have to do something about it. But it comes through with governors, for instance. I sent Imran an article on that was in Politico last week, and it was about the six governors in the U.S. are doing a really good job, and 6 governors are doing a really bad job. And I'd like to think, at least with some of the 6, that courage is, although they don't use that particularly reference, that courage is an important part of that. And when you're courageous, you could be boring and courageous. You could be charismatic and not the least bit courageous. You could be really a boring bureaucrat and be courageous. I'm sorry, I'm a little bit rambling because I don't know how to.
Thank you for that. We'll turn to Fatime now, and then we'll come to Dr. Waqar. So Fatime.
Shall I just say, okay, I thought you were sharing. Thank you very much for your explanation and opening the concept of leadership. I really learned a lot, which is that's about leaders who actually meet tough decisions. It's about tough decisions. It's about quick decisions. It's about correct decisions. So I wonder, what do you think about some UN organizations which still are continuing doing their recent projects, which in my view, it's kind of waste of budget. It's actually doing an inefficient work, wasting time. So what is your view?
Yes, that's a good question, Fatima. I think it's not just for UN, but for any bureaucracy, really, right? That right now should be reevaluating what it's doing and whether or not
Yes,
it's
you're
yeah,
right.
and whether or not what it's doing is still relevant and important. So you know what I would do, frankly, if you see that and you want to do something about it. If somebody's raised it to the national level of that agency and not getting anywhere, I'd write a letter right to the head of the organization and say, at this point in time, what we think that project ABC is not meeting any of the right needs, but there are a lot of other needs, and we think you should consider reprogramming. But now's the time when they do need to think outside the box. They do have. I went to a meeting last week with a group that comes out of the UN Staff College, and they had some sort of a strategic planner from many different UN agencies that they were trying to think outside the box. They were trying to say, how do we? They weren't taking project by project or anything. It was just more of a conceptual. How do we rethink what we're doing, and how do we think what's needed? And so whether or not that bubbles up to decision makers, not just planners, I don't know. And it's also, the time is very important too, because we shouldn't be wasting money and effort now. We should be considering changing now. So if you have a way to write to someone, I would do that with suggestions. Why? Because the bureaucracy is just going to keep doing the bureaucracy, including the local staff, right? Because that's their job.
Thank you. So we've also been joined by Dr. Waqar Ahmed, who is the Joint Executive Director of SDPI. Before we were doing introduction, Waqar, and you weren't here, so perhaps a few words about your interests, your research interests, and then you can ask your question, please.
Well, thank you, and really a pleasure to have Catherine here. So basically, yes, I do have a management responsibility at SDPI, but of course, I'm a researcher too, and I, of course, take care of economic growth, trade, and public funds side of research. So very interesting. Thank you very much for sharing these important ideas. One of the things that I just wanted to pick up on was your point about cooperative federalism. And this is perhaps what we as Pakistanis would like or sort of want our policymakers to act upon. And the first COVID public seminar, which we had online, was in fact with the Minister for Interprovincial Coordination. And she also emphasized this point that hopefully we do understand that there could be different governments in different provinces, but hopefully all will come together and sort of practice cooperative federalism. The only point that I wanted to sort of put on the table was that the current scenario, and of course I'm taking sort of a different angle on leadership here, that current scenario also allows certain types of leaders to perhaps perhaps camouflage incompetence, if I can use the word. And this is where probably the role of local and community organization comes in, if they can play a greater role of social accountability. So many of the political leaders who would be going into an election cycle would like the election cycle to be extended, taking, of course, cue that there is the COVID threat and let's extend the elections. Many of the countries who would be embarking on, let's say, a structural reforms agenda would like to pend many of those painful reforms which require them to burn a lot of political capital just because they are now getting good bit of foreign funding in the name of COVID, and they can put those necessary structural reforms on the back burner. And I felt that this is where the role of independent think tanks, NGOs comes in, that they have to continue to play a social accountability role. So my question here would be that how do you see the role of policy think tanks in this very fast changing scenario, while at one point, of course, one of the demands on institutions like ours is to produce new evidence and put it on the table of policymakers. But I think on the other side, we also represent stakeholders from the communities who would like to see greater transparency when, of course, aid on COVID reaches the developing countries. Thanks.
Yeah, great, a really great question. I just want to mention one thing about postponing elections. After September 11th, 2001, there was a New York City mayoral race coming up in November, early November of 2001. And Rudy Giuliani, then the popular mayor of New York City, talked about, or some of his people talked about, postponing the election because of what had just happened in New York. And obviously it was not done, and Michael Bloomberg was elected the new mayor. But it was the right precedent not to postpone. I can see people wanting to postpone now, and in fact, there's been a couple of primaries here postponed, in the US. But it is one example, the one thing that I think we ought to be extremely careful about. Think tanks are always in a nice space, a comfortable space, but an important space, and it's even more important now. I say nice, I'm not quite sure the right word to use, but it's because you can be independent, responsible, and forward-thinking in ways that a bureaucracy or a political party or someone else cannot be. And so your role as an intellectual leader in the community and in the country, and in fact in the world, is even more enhanced now that, first of all, governments are totally consumed with COVID, and second of all, communities are totally consumed with it. But at the same time, there is a lot of vacuum in leadership, either because people don't know what to do or aren't doing what they need to do. There's not so much a vacuum when somebody actually knows what to do and is doing it. So I think you can do a lot of things to fill that vacuum by fill your normal space plus the new vacuum space. It's not going to be around for a long time, for a long period of time, but to be able to give out advice about what ought to be done. And it's obviously in every country, the situation is going to be different in terms of how much advice or where or how you can present it. But I would really think that now of all times is a place for the rest of the country and the world to find out the capacity of think tanks and what they can provide in terms of leadership direction for the future. And that could be whether it's on trade or education or gender equality or energy, social protection. I mean, and it could certainly be around how the transparency of using public funds. I mean, who is going to be talking about that? Setting up a system now about even if it's your own kind of priority system for what ought to be known about the money that's being spent on COVID, what ought to be known about money that's coming in from DFID. What did DFID give to the government? What did they say when they gave it? How much did they give? What are the priorities that they expect? And what kind of accountability do they expect? And the government's not going to publish that. But if you did it in kind of soundbite ways, I mean something not just the document from the between the governments, but some way that that the general public could understand it. And then that could be a way to help generate interest in the community about asking how it was spent, or about pushing the government to spend it in the way it was given to be spent. I just picked DFID as an example. I don't know who's doing what.
Thank you for that. Do other colleagues have any questions right now? You may turn your mic on, and then I'll see it, and then we can call upon you. If not, Dr. Khwaja has another question, and he's alluding to the statement by the South Korean Minister for Environment during her tenure, where she complained about the male colleagues not cooperating as much as they should. And he'd like to know if during your experience, you came across certain instances in which your gender, because of your gender, you might have faced some hurdles, and how did you overcome them?
Oh, certainly. I don't know there's a woman alive who hasn't faced some hurdles because of their gender. Sometimes, once in a while, it's an opportunity. Oh, we need more women here. So, and I'm in the right place at the right time. But certainly there have been hurdles. So I'll give you a couple of examples. We had, when Kofi Annan was Secretary General, one of his reforms was that he created committees, one for development and one for emergency, and several others, but those were the two that WFP was placed on. So the one for development was called the UN Development Group, and it exists today still. And he said the 4 principal agencies that will be on UN Development Group will be UNDP, UNICEF, UNFPA, and WFP. And the principal agencies would be on the emergency group. It would be led by OCHA, and also it would include UNHCR, WFP, UNDP, and UNICEF. So at the time, we certainly had a critical mass of women in leadership at the top of those organizations. So in the development group, the head of UNDP was an American man. The head of UNICEF was an American woman. I was at WFP, and Nafis Siddique, Pakistani doctor, was at UNFPA. So there were a lot of issues, mostly around how UNDP managed the resident coordinator process, and how most of the people that were resident coordinators at that time were from UNDP. Everybody else wanted to open it up, have more of the skills provided by other people, not just UNDP, have it be UNDP be more transparent in how they managed it. I mean, there's just a lot of issues relating to UNDP. It was just natural, that's what it was. So virtually every meeting that the 4 of us had, these issues came up. And of course, there were 3 of us who pushed very hard on these issues, led by Nafis, I should say. And then, but UNDP was the one that had to take action, and often didn't, or took their time. So, so this man, head of UNDP, started telling people, complaining to people, subordinates and others, that the women were trying to push him around, and it was just the women were just interested in these issues, and they weren't really important issues, and it was really pretty disgusting as it find at that high level of the United Nations. And so I called him on it. I said, look, this demeans you, and it demeans your organization, and it demeans the system, and it really shouldn't happen. I mean, we could handle ourselves. But it was structural. It wasn't anything else. And over at the emergency part, for a while there was there were a couple of different guys from Japan who were the head of OCHA. But at one point, not only were his principals, again, the American man from UNDP, a Japanese woman, Sadako Ogata from HCR, Carol Bellamy from UNICEF, and me from WFP. And then the American Assistant Secretary of State, who mostly was involved in these, was named Julia Taft. And so one time the Italian foreign ministry officials told me that the man who was head of OCHA was complaining because he was surrounded by women, and it was very difficult to do his job surrounded by women, because not only did he have Mrs. Ogata, Mrs. Bellamy, Mrs. Bertini, But the Americans gave him Mrs. Taft, and the Italians gave him Mrs. Bonino, Emma Bonino. So, you know, we could, on one hand, feel sorry for these guys, but not really. We didn't feel sorry for them for a second, because, you know, for a change, there was a majority female, and they were having a hard time handling it. But it was, sometimes people didn't kind of accept who I was. You know, I'm going to be dealing with, said one man to me, I'm going to be dealing with the Undersecretary General who's head of the World Food Program. And I said, well, that would be me. No, not you, the head of the World Food Program. So that kind of stuff happened a lot. When I joined the World Food Program, I was 42 years old. It was the second youngest, I think, ever in any agency. I was the third woman. And so there were a lot of expectations. Oh, and I'm 5'1". So there were a lot of expectations that this little girl really wasn't going to be able to do anything. And there were a lot of people who thought that, you know, okay, they'd put up with her, but they would really be running the show. And people tried to keep information from me or make decisions and say they were mine and they weren't. And it didn't take long to find out a lot of that stuff was going on. But I found at the beginning I had to take some difficult decisions and show that I could and get over this low expectation business. Although, again, Kofi Annan told me once, and I even put it in the paper, and he said this totally out of the blue. We weren't even discussing an issue like this. He said, don't worry if people underestimate you, because then it's just easier to surprise them. So I thought that was really good advice. But no, I had jobs in younger years where I'd accept a job which sounded very interesting, and then I'd get there and they'd say, oh, we just lost our secretary, can you type? You know, that kind of thing. That's still goes on forever. But I have to say to everybody that it's not just one individual who somebody might give a hard time to. It's how important it is that there's lots of diversity at the table, that there's enough women that's at the table, whether it's at a think tank or in the government or in the private sector, that there's enough women at the table that you hear enough diverse views. And I don't mean about gender things necessarily, about whatever the topics are, that you hear from a range of diverse views. You also have enough, you have to have enough people from different ethnic groups and from different regions. But this is, I don't believe that there are solid long-term thoughtful decisions that will really last unless they're made based on information from diverse sectors.
Thank you for that. We've got one final question that our colleague Kashif Salek would like to ask, and then we'll conclude. Kashif?
Yeah, thank you very much, Dr. Imran, and thank you, Catherine, for providing a useful background of leadership in crisis. Actually, I have a question related to the decision making in recent in this crisis, in COVID-19 crisis. You know that when the crisis started in China, and then whole world was watching and passing comments on their leadership, on their culture, on their eating, and all this stuff, and they all are watching, and they are not alert, they are not gaining the knowledge, and they are not preparing themselves. So I feel that there is a leadership crisis, a great leadership crisis. Not only the leadership crisis, but there is a huge knowledge gap, that how to get lessons from the area which is in right now in the crisis, and how we can prepare for that. So we can now see that the West, which is more developed, and most of the people look forward for their model for leadership, their model for democracy, blah blah things. But now we see that this crisis has has hit hard to the West, and there is no, and the West has no way to move forward, and they are helpless actually. So my question is that what major flaw in leadership you have seen? You know, you just the Trump is calling the virus as a China virus, so it's a huge mockery is going, huge unseriousness is there. Second question is that I like to ask you that about future decision making, that how we can get lessons from this current process, because we have failed our supply chain, food supply chain. We see that the food are become very short, and there's the people which are currently very vulnerable. They are become more vulnerable in the future. So just I like to ask you a question about what should be and what are our directions of future decision making, particularly in the West, and also what will this impact to the global relief programs, supporting the global climate negotiations and food programs, etc. So how the future will look like for you? Thank you.
Wow, that's a big question. Big questions. Thank you. First of all, yeah, everybody totally. Well, they totally made a mistake. Everybody that ignored, what was going on in China in December and January. And there's absolutely no excuse for it. There's none. When we've seen in our own lifetimes, when we've seen other epidemics move, that we weren't ready to jump on this one is a huge problem. And it's been predicted, and Imran and I were talking before the Bill Gates speech, the TED Talk of some time ago, where he talks about this prospect. It's not that it wasn't known that it could be a problem, and yet nothing was done. There was a WHO comment toward the end of January about this is not going to be a pandemic or something. I don't remember exactly what they said, but it's not just them; it's all the countries around the world who didn't jump. I read an analysis recently that said one reason why Southeast Asia has been somewhat better in terms of managing it is because they had put systems in place after SARS and MERS and some of the other epidemics and fast-moving diseases they had, that they actually had some public health systems in Vietnam and in Singapore and elsewhere that actually could react in a much more manageable way, and to the extent Chinese would have had such things too. So the rest of us, no, we weren't prepared at all, and we didn't get a wake-up call even in January when this started to happen, or when the first case arrived in the United States from China. So we were not ready, and at this point, in the U.S., a lot of people are finger pointing of who, why. Well, we just weren't ready. We're not at all ready. Just today, there was a report out from Health and Human Services, U.S. Health and Human Services, that we didn't start ordering more equipment until mid-March. So, I mean, this is a bit crazy. And we have, it hasn't much made the news yet, but we have a lot of big hospitals outside of the places like New York City that are so massively affected. We have a lot of big hospitals that are close to empty because the governors have said no elective surgeries, and also because people aren't as thrilled to get elective surgery and maybe go to a place where they might pick up the virus, so they're next to empty while other ones are totally overflowing. But these other hospitals are further away from New York or Miami or something, and the patients are in such bad shape by the time they need hospitalization, they can't move them. So it's just, the whole thing is just not been properly thought out, and certainly will be. certainly will be for the future. There'll be a lot more effort put on there. And as I said at the beginning, I think it's going to change some of the ways in which we do medicine. I think there's going to be more emphasis on telemedicine. I think there'll be a lot more emphasis. You mentioned supply chain management, but not just for medicine, but for all of our society. How come it works here that we can order something from Amazon and get it the next day, and you can't order a surgical mask and get it in 2 months? So, there's just so many related issues that are going to have to be thought through. So the planning for the next round, the decision making, as you said, for the next round is going to have to be critically important. And it also begs the question about international leadership. Bill Gates has been talking about this for a while, and I did some work for a while with Raj Shah, who's the president of Rockefeller Foundation, and he was talking about this several years ago because post Ebola, he was on one of those high-level panels. There were 4 high-level panels. Maybe we should make a pool. How many high-level panels are going to be now after this is over? Because there'll be 4 high-level panels in every country, right? So anyway, he was involved in one of the high-level panels for Ebola, and he said we really don't have any international planning properly done. And so I did some work for him on this thinking, at least, which comes to that. Think about the issue is a health issue. It starts as a health issue, but the minute it becomes an epidemic, let alone a pandemic, it goes beyond health because it affects everything and everybody. It affects every ministry of your government. It affects every industry. It affects every production, all workers, education, everything. So it no longer can be managed by the health ministry pretty quickly. And usually the political leadership wants to be in charge of it because they don't want it to be blamed for it, and they want to try to direct it. Now, some of them are competent and some of them aren't. But internationally, we have WHO. But when it goes beyond, then what do we have? We don't have a set or a range of people responsible for giving the right kind of direction and coalescing the right kind of interests beyond health to be able to address the current problem and prevent a future problem. And that's something I think we need to think very seriously about.
Thank you very much for that. Before we leave, I've got a quick question that that's on my mind. It's not directly related to the discussion that we're having right now, but perhaps we could use your insights, and that is the reform at the UN, reform at the Security Council, perhaps expanding it. For the benefit of our colleagues, if you could take a couple of minutes to just lead us through what's been happening over the past decade or 2 decades, and then whether we're going to see this through, or do you think that any chance of reform happening is a non-starter at this stage?
Well, as you know, in the Charter of the UN, it says that there will be a Security Council with 5 permanent members that have veto power, and those, as a result of World War II, were then USSR, China, the UK, France, and the US. China became Russia. USSR became Russia, and China changed leadership, but nonetheless, it's remained essentially the same, even though the council itself has expanded since the charter. Any sort of effort to change it is subject to veto of one of those 5 members, which is why I'm a pessimist about whether or not there could be any change. But what has happened over time, every once in a while, there's a discussion about expansion of one sort or another, permanent members without veto or with veto or whatever. It bubbles up every once in a while and then it goes away. Now, as a result of this crisis, might it bubble up? I don't know. But I haven't seen them do anything at all now recently about the crisis. So will this be an impetus for other countries? I'm not close enough to be able to make that prediction. But you know very well what happens once there's a conversation that gets started about this. Way back in the Clinton administration time, there was a serious discussion about adding Germany and Japan. And the Italian ambassador was quoted as going around to member states. He came to the U.S. and said, but why not Italy? We lost the war too. And then, you know, they talk about Brazil, the biggest country in South America. And then people say, well, wait, they're not even Spanish speaking. And what about Argentina or Mexico? And then there's a discussion about whether Nigeria, the biggest country in Africa, or South Africa, or Ethiopia, or Egypt, I mean, who should be an African representative? And then, of course, if India is mentioned, then Pakistan says, yeah, but what about us? And when Japan is talked about, traditionally the Chinese haven't been enthused. So how could it possibly be done? I'm like I said, I'm a skeptic, and I've always thought that the only way is some sort of an international emergency that would generate enough interest to want to change that institution. I'm not that close to it now, but I haven't seen that yet.
So thank you very much on that note. Really appreciate, Professor Bertini, your participation in this seminar. Your insights have been very helpful. You know, it's been a real pleasure having you with us. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for including me, and good luck to you. I'll be watching. I'll be following your publications on your website and your activities, and hoping to find some really provocative ideas. Thanks, Imran, so much.
We'll try and share them with you as well. So
thank
you very much, colleagues, and Professor Bertini.
Thank you.
Thank you, Imran. Thank you all.